Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker and I'm joined by Helena, aka No Justice MTG on YouTube and Twitch. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Not a problem. Always a pleasure to co-host with you, Michael.
If you're wondering where Ash Sarkar is, she's under the weather today. Apparently, she might be tired from spending so much of her weekend rescuing cats. If you follow her on Twitter or Instagram, you'll know what I'm talking about. If not, you'll be completely confused. So you should check her out on both of those platforms. Coming up later tonight, we'll bring some of the latest news from events in Gaza. Gideon Falter's clash with the police at a Palestine march has sparked discussion across the weekend. We'll look at what's actually going on, and the media have been fooled by yet another lie about the October 7th attack. Stay tuned for all of that. Rishi Sunak is trying to rescue his premiership by reviving his favourite dead-end policy, stopping small boats. He said this in a press conference earlier.
I can confirm that we've put an airfield on standby, booked commercial charter planes for specific slots, and we have 500 highly trained individuals ready to escort illegal migrants all the way to Rwanda, with 300 more trained in the coming weeks. This is one of the most complex operational endeavours the Home Office has carried out. But we are ready. Plans are in place. And these flights will go come what may. No foreign court will stop us from getting flights off.
So Rishi Sunak is way, way behind in the polls. The Tories are looking at a thumping whenever they decide to actually have a general election. And the Prime Minister seems to think that the idea of a few planes taking off to Rwanda will be just the thing to rescue them, to sort of make people realise, oh, this government's really amazing because 4 or 5 planes have gone to Rwanda, right? It's cruel. It won't work. Rishi Sunak disagrees, though. He suggests that this can actually deter migrants from coming to the UK in small boats.
It's important that we do this properly. Right? There are going to be people, as we've seen at every turn, who try and oppose us and undermine us, and that's why we should prepare and implement this thoroughly. For example, we want to make sure that the quality of the decision-making is absolutely great, because in the past people have raised concerns with that and used that as an excuse to frustrate the policy. That's why it's important that we've trained people and we take the time to make those decisions very rigorously. But also, as I said, this isn't just about one flight, right? Yeah, could you rush and get one flight off? Maybe you could, but that's not the priority here. The priority is being able to deliver a regular rhythm, a drumbeat of multiple flights a month over the summer and beyond, because that's how you build a systematic deterrent, and that's how you will stop the boats. And that is a system that the team and I have worked very hard to put in place, and it's important that we take the time to get that right, to build the deterrent that we all want to see to stop the boats.
So he's saying this is the most complex operation the Home Office have sort of ever done. Now, anyone who does, this is one thing that unites the left and the right in this country. Everyone agrees the Home Office is absolutely useless and can't tie its own shoelaces. So the idea that you can give it the most complex task it's ever had and it's going to be a success, I think is somewhat far-fetched. I also don't understand how he thinks we're going to have this sort of permanent flow of planes flying up to Rwanda, because the Rwandans have said they can only house people in the hundreds. So obviously, if you wanted this to be a deterrent, now I think the policy is quite cruel to begin with anyway. But if you're looking at it in terms of practicalities, you would need to send a lot of people to Rwanda for it to work as a deterrent. Now, why do I say that? Because people who've crossed the channel to come to the UK have already taken some massive risks. They've already risked their lives. They've risked their livelihoods. It's very, very difficult to get here. The idea that, oh, it's just easy, these are just people who want a free ride. No, if you've traveled all the way to France and then you're about to risk your life crossing the channel, you really want to get to the UK. So a 1% chance that you're going to get sent to Rwanda is not going to stop you, right? You've already taken bigger risks than the very small risk, which it will remain, of being sent to Rwanda. Now, before Rishi Sunak gave that press conference, Deputy Foreign Secretary Andrew Mitchell defended the scheme on Radio 4.
the remarkable regime in Rwanda over the last 30 years has come back from the abyss, a country completely destroyed by the genocide. It is absolutely extraordinary what the Rwandan government have achieved in all walks of life. It is a safe country. And indeed, if you look at the statistics, Kigali is arguably safer than London. So I have no doubts at all about the safety of Rwanda and the efficacy of this scheme.
But in 2018, they opened fire on protesting refugees, this remarkable regime.
Well, this remarkable regime has managed to look after extraordinary numbers of refugees. There are something like 140,000 refugees looked after in Rwanda. You are raising a highly contested incident, but the facts are clear. There are enormous numbers of refugees in Rwanda who are well looked after by
the
the
ones, for example, who
UN.
arrived from Israel under a similar scheme. Most of them ended up leaving, didn't they? They didn't see it as a country that they wanted to settle in.
The UNHCR runs a specific scheme which takes people from the Mediterranean, from Libya, into Rwanda. If the UNHCR thinks it's right and proper and safe to do that, then I think we should be perfectly confident that the British government, in reaching the same conclusion, is also correct.
Now, that was a very impassioned defence of Rwanda as a destination to send refugees. But not everyone agrees, including Andrew Mitchell. He wrote this just 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago to the day, in fact, so April the 19th, 2022. And in the Conservative Home, he argued the government's Rwanda plan will be impractical, ineffective and expensive. Now, back then, he wrote this: "It is a myth that those crossing the channel and taking appalling risks in leaky boats are African economic migrants looking for a cushy new life. If only that were true. The new plan to cart them off to Central Africa makes no distinction between those fleeing persecution and economic migrants seeking to come here when they are not welcome." It goes on, those being deported will physically resist. They will superglue themselves to structures. The international media will show pictures of British officials forcing desperate people genuinely seeking asylum onto aeroplanes. Civilian planes may well not be willing to take off with detainees on board. Pilots won't be willing to fly, and their insurers won't give them insurance. He's got more arguments against the Rwanda policy. He says, nor will people sent to Rwanda necessarily stay there. Having already shown determination to start a new life in the UK, they will start their long, weary journey all over again. This is one of the reasons the Israeli government abandoned their attempt at a similar scheme with Rwanda. Now, this is exactly the point that Michal Hussein put to Andrew Mitchell on Radio 4 this morning. So he made the same point two years ago. Now he seems very, very keen to ignore that question put to him now that he's a government minister. Back in 2022 as well, he was also disparaging about the cost of a Rwanda scheme. So he said back then, and there is the cost. We are already paying the Rwandan government a fee of £120 million, and credible estimates drawn up for the approach, now abandoned by Australia, suggest it would be cheaper to put these poor people up in the splendour of the Ritz Hotel. So you can decide who you find more trustworthy. Was it Andrew Mitchell when he was a backbench MP, and I suppose could speak his mind because he wasn't subject to the collective responsibility that one is when they're on the front bench? Or is it the Andrew Mitchell who has to toe the line because he wants to keep his job? Which one do you think was telling the truth? I'm going to talk about the politics of all of this in a moment with Helena. First, though, I'm really delighted to be joined by the journalist Sally Hayden to talk about the facts on the ground for refugees in Rwanda. Sally is an award-winning journalist focused on the experiences of refugees and author of the book My Fourth Time We Drowned, about the EU's border policies. Thanks so much for joining us, Sally. You've reported twice from Rwanda, as I understand, on the experience specifically of refugees in the country. That was in 2019 and 2020. So could you talk about the context of those trips and what you discovered?
Yeah, sure. So I've reported 3 times from Rwanda in total, twice, like you said, on the experience of refugees. And specifically, I was focused on actually what Andrew Mitchell was referring to there, the EU-backed UNHCR-supported scheme, which evacuates people from Libya, and they transit through Rwanda and normally spend some months there and then are moved on to Western countries. So basically, because in Libya, it's quite difficult to do like a full kind of asylum interview process, and they move people to Rwanda and they do it there instead. So like equating the two, I know the Home Office used that as an example They keep arguing and referencing it, but actually it's quite different because people aren't actually going to Rwanda long term. They're being moved on. But yeah, I went there to meet refugees who were moved from Libya. I went to Rwanda 2019. I was given accreditation by authorities because they explicitly told me they thought that I would write good things about them. I still wasn't given access to the actual transit center. I had a lot of contacts already who were among the people who had been evacuated, so I managed to meet them outside. But they were quite anxious about, being seen talking to me like informers, the fact that they could get in trouble. And they felt like when we talk about safety, like there's different types of safety. There's kind of, whether there's crime on the streets, and then there's like living in a police state or a dictatorship where you feel like you can't speak freely, like anything you say could be used against you and you don't know how. And a lot of these people have escaped from dictatorships or from, oppressive systems. And they're very, very mentally tortured by being in one again. And Rwanda is a police state and a dictatorship. And so, yeah, that fear was very evident.
We'll talk a bit more about sort of authoritarianism in Rwanda in a moment. I just want to sort of be clear, because I think you sort of discovered things not necessarily from talking to people in the country because they were so terrified, but also sort of by message afterwards. And I know you've reported on, some quite appalling allegations involving sexual abuse. I think. I wonder if you could talk about that a bit.
I met people there. I went to the camp many times, actually, over the 2 visits. And I was in touch with people who were there, all the time, basically, because we had already been in touch when they were in Libya. So we were in constant communication. And one of the things that emerged was this allegation of alleged sexual assault of a minor, a refugee boy. And I actually didn't go public with this. Like initially I was kind of sending, because I was contacted by them. They had already been contacting me when they were in Libya, when there were issues. And I actually contacted authorities and said, this has happened. And basically the allegation was against like a police chief who was in the camp. And they were saying that the man was still there and that there hadn't been an investigation and that the boy was very distressed. And I contacted authorities and said what had happened. And basically what transpired was that before a proper investigation was done, the Rwandan police force went public and said that the boy was lying. And at that point, we then published a report in British media, in a British newspaper. And then the president's spokesperson came out and accused me of writing refugee porn. And yeah, I was getting like harassed by kind of government-backed or government-aligned anyway, Twitter trolls, and a government-aligned newspaper published a report as well, repeating this. They said like I peddled lies, that again that I write refugee porn. And yeah, after that, I mean, I hadn't been back to Rwanda since 2020. And one chapter of my book, by the way, is kind of details all of this. My reporting was submitted as evidence in the legal challenge against the UK government against this deportation scheme. And I then tried to go back to Rwanda last month, and I was barred from boarding the plane. I was told that Rwandan authorities had emailed the airline and said that I was not allowed on, specifically like given my name. And so I don't know exactly, is it because of that reporting? I haven't been given an official reason as to why it happened. But yeah, it really has underlined to me that, like this was just the thing that I reported was just one thing. And actually I'd been speaking to authorities about it. It was like, maybe it was small in the grand scheme of things, but the fact that anything negative seems to be reacted to with you being barred, apparently anyway. It just shows that there's not really scope for like tracking the consequences of a policy like this. Like you'll send people into effectively like a black hole where all the information that you hear about them will come from, potentially communications officials or PR people or, politicians. But we won't actually, if there are problems, you're not going to hear about it.
So you said sort of the first time you were given permission to report from Rwanda, they quite explicitly said they thought it was because you were going to write nice stories about them. And then when you wrote stories which weren't nice about them, which were actually quite critical, you were banned from the country. And I suppose the thing this brings to the forefront of my mind is that since the UK government announced their Rwanda policy, we've had quite a lot of trips whereby sort of the Home Secretary goes and visits some Rwandan officials, and they take a bunch of journalists with them, and then the journalists sort of take pictures around at some housing that the Rwandan government have built for anyone who might be deported from the UK to Rwanda. What would your message be in terms of the journalistic ethics of going on those trips and taking the pictures that the Rwandan government wants you to take? And do you think there is a danger of us getting a misleading image of that country?
Yeah, I mean, I think that journalists trying to get access is always a challenge. And yeah, there's certain things that you do to get access. I'm not saying like publish lies or anything, but I mean, sometimes you take visas where you can get them, you take accreditation when you can get it. And it's not necessarily that would be false information, but yeah, it's like what I report on Libya. I reported, like, my book is mostly about the treatment of people in Libyan migrant detention centers, and I had direct communication with people there through phones, and so they could send me directly their testimonies on what was happening without that being listened into by guards and that sort of thing. Whereas if journalists visit, there'd be kind of a cleanup operation. Everything that's said is being monitored. We see this, as journalists, you're conscious of this. And so it's not to say that it's wrong to do those trips, but I think you need to expand your reporting and try and speak to people separately and be aware that Rwanda is not a place where people can talk freely.
And I suppose a cynic might say that's actually quite helpful for the government, because it means that, if they do end up deporting people to Rwanda and they suffer human rights abuses, well, no one's going to find out about it anyway, which presumably is what the government are more worried about than the human rights abuses themselves. This is me being cynical about our government. Perhaps they're actually much more noble people. Before I let you go, I want to ask, because I know you've reported at length, and your book is all about EU border policies. And when sort of, Rishi Sunak stands up and announces, his Rwanda policy, etc., lots of defenders of it say, look, this isn't the United Kingdom being sort of an outlier. This is a conversation which is happening in all sorts of European capitals who are all trying to come up with policies to restrict the flow of migration to their borders. And I wonder if you could sort of give us a brief summary of the scene in the European Union and how governments are responding to migration at the moment.
Can I just say, I'm not the most eloquent person. I'm not like a natural broadcaster, by the way. So if people would read the book, they get a much more full view of all of this, including the chapter on Rwanda and the kind of precursor to this UK deal. We're seeing this. Western countries generally are implementing increasingly abusive policies. The EU, what I've reported on is the interceptions of people who try to cross the central Mediterranean, who often get forced back to Libya and locked up indefinitely in these detention centers where there are allegations of crimes against humanity. This Rwanda deal is kind of another example of mental torture. The whole idea seems to be deterrence, creating the kind of cruelest deterrence possible to make you the least likely country for people to go to. And at the same stage, the scale of crises in the world right now are so massive. I was standing on the South Sudan border with Sudan a few weeks ago, and 1,000 people on average around are crossing the border every day fleeing the Sudan war. More than 10 million are displaced now in Sudan or outside, that they've fled Sudan. And that's just one example of crisis currently happening, and kind of expecting that you will not feel the rules of global suffering. It's just not possible. Of course, every country is going to feel that. So responding with cruelty. I'm a journalist. I don't propose policy, but I do think that we need to understand the implications of our policies. And so much dehumanization is happening, and there's just been a total removal from actually listening to the voices of the people affected. And this Rwanda deal, it's another example of putting people in a situation where they can't speak. So you speak for them and they will be silenced, and we won't be hearing their stories or their experiences or what happens to them.
Sally Hayden, thank you so much for your time this evening. Our audience can check out your book, My Fourth Time We Drowned, winner of the Orwell Prize for Nonfiction. So thank you so much for speaking to us this evening. Helena, I want to bring you in on this because I suppose we've been talking about the international element, the element of what's going on in Rwanda. We haven't touched so much on the politics of this. Rishi Sunak clearly thinks that this is an issue which he can gain some advantage on when it comes to a general election. Do you think is he onto something there, or is he deluding himself?
The thing is, when it comes to the Rwanda policy within the Conservative Party, I'll say broadly, there are kind of three camps when it comes to this. So the first one are the kind of the true believers. Now, whether they're doing it sincerely or whether they're doing it tactically, they are putting their full weight of support behind Rwanda, regardless of the political efficacy of it, but they're doing it because they genuinely believe that it is a solution to the migrant crisis overall, that it is necessary to do to protect our borders, like the Bravamans and Genrics of this world. Outside of that, you also have kind of the quiet, like objectors, the position kind of previously held by people like Andrew Mitchell, but also Rishi Sunak and James Cleverly too. You've got to remember the current Home Secretary who was pushing this stuff initially called the Rwanda scheme batshit, to quote him on that one. So they've previously been kind of objectors, but they've moved to this third group, who kind of tactically support it. Because there's a long thread amongst kind of people in the Conservative Party who have this genuine belief, as you've rightly pointed out there, that this is going to be some way of them clawing back electoral support whenever the election happens. The issue, of course, with this is that I think they've misapprehended a lot of the polling around this issue. Because, yeah, there is a lot of kind of, plurality support for the Rwanda plan. At least there was 6 months ago. That might have changed at least somewhat recently. But at the very least, it's not like a dead in the water policy that everybody despises. The issue, of course, is it's not voters' concern. When it actually comes to the reason why the Conservative Party are in the doldrums that they're in, the Rwanda stuff, the migration stuff, like people have like strong views about it, but it's not the biggest concern, and it's not the reason why the Tories are going to be destroyed at the next election. It's the cost of living, it's the increase in mortgage rates, it's all of the other problems that directly affect people's kind of material conditions that they're living in, and other kind of things that they used to be able to run on very easily. When mortgage rates were low, like during the Cameron era, it was very easy for them to find an individual scapegoat, say, look at the scapegoat, this is going to be the way in which that we're going to drive a wedge between certain demographics of people, easy for them to be able to claw back support. They can't do that now. Their main demographic they rely on, mostly mortgage holders, have massively abandoned them. In some cases for Labour, but for like the economic competency that Labour want to position themselves on. But also on top of that, they are moving to Reform UK because they have no reason to stay with the Conservative Party that won't get them in terms of their migration policy ideas, but also have completely failed them when it comes to their economic immaterial interests too. So this coalition of voters has been completely broken. And whilst there are some small demographics who do care very strongly about the Rwanda plan, even amongst those demographics, things like the NHS and cost of living still outperform them in terms of polling with which people's actual main policy concerns lies. So when it comes to what they think this doubling down and tripling down on the Rwanda plan comes, is this idea that I think they're trying to, in damage control mode, I think all of the people who've moved over to voting Labour because of economic concerns, they're not getting those voters back. And I don't think they can get them back now. But what they are worried about is the move towards people who are supporting Reform UK. But the demographic also includes people who can't trust the Tories on the economy either. So this idea that somehow, miraculously, 100, 200 people being shipped to Rwanda and it not having any real impact in terms of whether or not people do come across in small boats, because I think both of us will believe that it's not really going to be a proper deterrent. That means that they're not going to win these Reform UK voters back who truly have abandoned the Conservatives, and not just on illegal immigration or irregular migration. That's what this is, irregular migration. But they're losing really and truly on legal migration, the 700,000 net migration in terms of student visas. And whether or not we send planes to Rwanda, those votes are also gone. So it's seeming to be a broadly deluded Conservative Party that has nothing left to campaign on.
The head of Israel's military intelligence has resigned over its failure to prevent the October 7th Hamas attack. In his resignation letter, Major General Aharon Haliva said this: "The intelligence directorate under my command did not live up to the task we were entrusted with. I have carried that black day with me ever since, day after day, night after night. I will carry the horrible pain of the war with me forever. It is appropriate to set up a state inquiry commission that can thoroughly, deeply, comprehensively, and critically investigate all the factors and circumstances that led to the tragic events." That call for a state inquiry into the factors that led up to October the 7th is likely to leave Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu feeling nervous as protests against his government grow in Israel. He has so far refused to accept any responsibility for security failures that allowed the attack to unfold. Protesters are now calling for early elections, and they've demanded that Netanyahu's negotiators reach an immediate deal for the release of hostages still held by Hamas and other armed groups in Gaza. According to polling by the Israel Democracy Institute, more than 62% of Israelis believe those responsible for the failures of the 7th of October should resign, and 51% support elections by the end of this year. In other bad news for the Netanyahu government, a UN-commissioned independent inquiry headed by a former French foreign minister has released a report into Israel's claims about UNRWA being infiltrated by Hamas. The inquiry has found Israel's government has so far provided no evidence linking the aid agency to terrorism. The report concludes that UNRWA has regularly supplied lists of its employees to Israel, but that, quote, the Israeli government has not informed UNRWA of any concerns relating to any UNRWA staff based on these staff lists since 2011. And it said this about UNRWA's processes for ensuring the neutrality of their employees. The review revealed that UNRWA has established a significant number of mechanisms and procedures to ensure compliance with the humanitarian principles, with emphasis on the principle of neutrality, and that it possesses a more developed approach to neutrality than other similar UN or NGO entities. So they're saying it actually goes above and beyond what other agencies do. Of course, Israel's claims about UNRWA were made in January on the same day that the ICJ found it plausible the country was committing genocide in Gaza, and those claims led to major donors cutting funding to the agency. Those countries included the US and the United Kingdom, disgracefully, I think. On those cuts, the report says this: in the absence of a political solution between Israel and the Palestinians, UNRWA remains pivotal in providing life-saving humanitarian aid and essential social services, particularly in health and education, to Palestinian refugees in Gaza, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and the West Bank. As such, UNRWA is irreplaceable and indispensable to Palestinians' human and economic development. In addition, many view UNRWA as a humanitarian lifeline. Relief agencies are needed more than ever in Gaza, with airstrikes continuing across the territory as Israel's war shows no sign of letting up. That was eyewitness footage of a strike on an area of central Gaza on Saturday. And on Sunday, that bombing continued. 22 people were killed in airstrikes on Rafah on Sunday night. 18 of them were children. They're the latest in the near-daily air raids that Israel has carried out on Rafah. That's a small area near the Egyptian border where around 1.5 million Palestinians are sheltering. This baby girl was one of the lucky ones. She was removed from the womb of her mother, who was killed in the strikes on Sunday. So lucky in that she survived, obviously very unlucky in that her mother has been killed. The woman was 30 weeks pregnant when her family home was hit by an Israeli bomb. Also killed were her husband and their 3-year-old daughter. So that baby is going to grow up without any parents. That's because of Israel's genocidal war. The surgeon who performed the operation that saved the girl told Sky News this.
We had to do an emergency cesarean to save the baby. Thanks to God, we managed to save the baby. The mother was in a very critical condition. Her brain was exposed, so we saved one of the two.
Elsewhere in Gaza, other scenes of carnage have been uncovered. In Khan Yunis, a mass grave has reportedly been discovered in the grounds of the Nasser hospital. That's the medical complex that was under IDF siege and raids throughout January and February. That was as the Israeli military attempted to clear Khan Yunis completely of Palestinians. According to reports, more than 200 bodies have been found in the temporary grave sites, including those of the elderly, women and children. These are on top of the 70 bodies that were discovered in the grounds after Israel withdrew its troops from the area earlier this month. All of this comes in the context of the United States approving a further massive delivery of funds to Israel. The House of Representatives on Saturday okayed a $17 billion military aid package for Israel. And Benjamin Netanyahu seemed pleased with the result, saying this: the US Congress just overwhelmingly passed a much appreciated aid bill that demonstrates strong bipartisan support for Israel and defends Western civilization. Thank you, friends. Thank you, America. Or if you're one of those people who associate Western civilization with genocide, then that tweet will only confirm your suspicions. There was other news that Netanyahu was less pleased about. That's because the US is expected to issue sanctions against an IDF unit in the West Bank for violations of human rights. This is reported by Axios. They say that the unit in question is the all-male Netzer Yehuda wing, which has been implicated in several violent attacks on Palestinians. In response to the news, Netanyahu said, "This sanctions must not be imposed on the Israel Defense Forces. In recent weeks, I have been working against the imposition of sanctions on Israeli citizens, including in my conversations with senior American government officials. At a time when our soldiers are fighting the monsters of terror, the intention to impose a sanction on a unit in the IDF is the height of absurdity and a moral low. The government headed by me will act by all means against these moves." So it's a very, typical rhetorical strategy by Benjamin Netanyahu, which I suppose is also carried out in policy, which is to say, thanks for the billions of pounds, but anytime you try and hold us to account, F you, we're not going to listen. We're going to fight this by any means necessary. Now, you might say, why does the United States give billions of pounds to a government that responds to the sanctioning of a unit by saying, F you, we're not going to listen to you, right? I would say that. I think most right-thinking people would say that. But the United States is still sending billions of aid to the kind of country which, as we've seen in footage before, is bombing families to the extent that you're seeing a child being born prematurely as her mother, father, and siblings are killed, right? This is what the United States is funding. And by the way, who British arms companies are still sending weapons to, because our government won't do anything to act. Really appalling, of course. I mean, some of those images that we showed you there, just really, really distressing. The war is not letting up. I mean, it will be 200 days since all of this began tomorrow. Since the October 7th Hamas attack, Western media have happily peddled misinformation about what actually happened that day. And they've shown that they love nothing more than a lurid headline, even when it's completely false. So in November, The Sun printed the lie that Hamas had baked babies alive in ovens. And just days after the attack, several papers ran the story that Hamas had beheaded 40 babies in one of the attacked kibbutzim. Again, that was completely false. One baby died on October the 7th, and they weren't beheaded. So those stories cannot possibly be true. But the Western press hasn't learned its lessons, because a new sensational claim about October the 7th and its aftermath has emerged. Survivors of October the 7th spoke in Israel's Knesset, calling for better mental health support and treatment for those traumatized by what they saw that day. One of them said this, quote, "I don't know if everyone knows, but there are close to 50 suicides among people from the Nova party. This number was true 2 months ago. It could be much higher now," unquote. Now, 50 people taking their own lives who attended that festival, that would be an absolutely shocking figure, right? And it's a figure that grabbed attention. The problem is, it's not true. So later that day, the Times of Israel published this article. So it says, Health Ministry firmly denies claim that 50 supernova survivors took their own lives. So you can see there, even the Israeli Health Ministry says the story wasn't true. But it was good enough for many in the Western press. So the Daily Mail published this headline: nearly 50 traumatized Israeli revelers have killed themselves since Nova Festival was attacked by Hamas on October the 7th, with others sectioned due to psychiatric issues, survivor tells Parliament. Rupert Murdoch's New York Post published the story to its large audience as well. As you can see there, nearly 50 attendees of Israel's Nova Festival died by suicide since October the 7th Hamas terrorist attack, survivor says. They have added survivor says, but what you've got there is just this big headline that suggests that 50 attendees of the Israel's Nova Festival did die by suicide, which even the Israeli Health Ministry denies. Despite this, the fake news also hit morning television in the United Kingdom.
On a completely different note, but something we shouldn't forget, going back to October the 7th and the original attack on Israel, I saw a story yesterday, and I can't completely sort of bottom it out, but they've had 50 suicides in Israel of youngish people who were so traumatized by that. So not necessarily taken hostage, but, they came close to death, they lost their friends, etc. So there's an awful lot going on still as a result of October the 7th, which we shouldn't forget.
So Jeremy Vine there did add the qualification, I haven't bottomed this out. I haven't checked this. But I mean, whatever the context, when you're talking about suicide, you should be very careful when you're reporting stuff. Even if there had been an event involving mass suicides, actually Samaritans and the like tell you not to sort of report suicides with motives, because that can, encourage copycat suicides, for example. So the reporting about this always has to be done very sensitively. And here you've got a situation where, a very small amount of research tells you this is false. And we have had so many stories like this. If you're a reporter who hasn't covered the Israel-Palestine conflict before, or maybe you don't cover sort of war zones very much, then I think it is completely unforgivable to have published any of those stories about beheaded babies or babies in ovens. I do think that's unforgivable. But you can understand how it happened in the fog of war in that immediate 7 days. Now, that doesn't make it forgivable, but you can say, well, it was in that immediate aftermath. 6 months later, to still be sort of accepting any lurid claim which is made about October the 7th and just sort of repeating it without checking it. Like if you're hearing a lurid claim from Israel, so many of them have turned out to be completely false that you really shouldn't repeat it without checking it. And it didn't take much checking to work out that this wasn't true. Right? So why are these falsities being pushed out? I think it's probably to distract from what's happening on the ground in Gaza, which everyone can see and world opinion is turning against. So I would advise our mainstream journalists not to fall for this. And you might say they're not falling for this, they're doing it intentionally. Well, if they're doing it intentionally, it's even worse, right? So whatever you're doing, buckle up, This should be condemned from all quarters.
You are quite openly Jewish. This is a pro-Palestinian march. I'm not accusing you of anything, but I'm worried about the reaction to your presence.
That was a pretty outrageous statement by a Met police officer, seemingly threatening to arrest someone for being openly Jewish at a pro-Palestine protest. Now, that clip, understandably, caused a large media storm. The police were under fire after their threat to arrest an openly Jewish man near pro-Palestinian protest, openly Jewish being the term used by the police. And some of the sharpest criticism, as you can imagine, came from right-wing outlets on Talk TV. This was former Met detective turned pundit Peter Bleksley.
The Metropolitan Police's mask has not slipped, it has fallen to the ground. The Metropolitan Police quite clearly have chosen a side here, and it is not the side of the moderate. It is not the side of the mainstream. It is the side of the mob.
Criticism also made its way onto the BBC. This was Laura Kuenssberg speaking to Government Minister Claire Coutinho on Sunday.
Just finally, there's been a building story in the last couple of days that we've mentioned already this morning about the Met's treatment of a Jewish man who was appeared while a pro-Palestinian rally was taking place, who a policeman essentially told him he shouldn't be there. Can you confirm that the Home Secretary has written to the Met Commissioner about what's happened here?
He has, but let me say that I think what has happened is a serious misstep, because what we can't be saying to particular groups in society that their very presence is a provocation. You don't want anybody of any community to feel like that, which is how the Jewish community has been made to feel.
The Jewish man in question, he's called Gideon Falter, was also given a large personal platform. He appeared on Sky News on Saturday.
We've waited 6 months for the Met to take control of these crowds, take control of the streets, make London safe for Londoners, for law-abiding Londoners. And he's failed to do that. And I think the time has come now for Mark Rowe to go. He should either resign or he should be removed by the Mayor and the Home Secretary. If it were an isolated incident, if it had taken place shortly after the war, I might accept that there was some kind of mishap, officers on the ground, several officers on the ground getting the wrong end of the stick. But that's not what it is. This has been happening as part of a pattern of behaviour now. And finally, it's on film. Finally, people are paying attention to it.
Gideon Falter repeated that call for the Met Commissioner to resign in an article in the Sunday Times. So it's headlined, "I was treated like a criminal for being Jewish. The Met chief must go." And then this is important because it says, pelted with insults like scum and Nazi after stumbling across a march. The leader of the campaign against anti-Semitism was told he could be arrested. Now, remember that claim about stumbling across the march. Of course, we should be absolutely clear. What the policeman in that clip we showed you at the start said to Gideon Falter is completely unacceptable. No one should be told that because they are openly or visibly Jewish, they might breach the peace and therefore should leave a public space. It was a terrible thing to say. But there was also something deeply misleading about this story, right? Because Gideon Falter has told the press he merely stumbled upon the march. And it's that idea that has tarred not only the police officer who said something wrong, but also the protesters themselves. Because if the mere presence of an openly Jewish person at a pro-Palestine march could cause a breach of the peace, then maybe these marches really do seem like festivals of anti-Semitism. The problem with that narrative, though, is this: Gideon Falter didn't just stumble upon the march. In fact, he was standing right next to a pro-Israeli counter-protest, and he was very intentionally trying to provoke a reaction. Now, we can confirm this because Sky News on Sunday published a full 13 minutes filmed by their own crew, which adds much more context than was included in the clip uploaded by Falter's campaign group. Now, in what you're about to see, the police officer gives the background to the clash with Falter that the campaign against anti-Semitism put out.
Unfortunately, you took it upon yourself to move from the pavement right into the middle of the pro-Palestinian march, which is why I asked you to go away. And even though you found it difficult, so my view is you are looking to try and antagonise us. No, you weren't. You chose to leave the pavement, walk right into the march and walk against it. So I can already see what your mindset is.
My mindset?
Yeah, I'll try not to be too disingenuous in this.
My mindset is that I'm Jewish in London.
Please don't be too disingenuous, sir.
I'm not being disingenuous. I can
I'm
walk
afraid you
wherever
are.
the hell I want.
I'm afraid you
If
are.
I want to walk to that pavement, that's what I'm going to do.
Sir,
But
if you
if
just
you're
stay
going to
there,
have to
please.
arrest me because I'm walking, but
I'd rather not do that.
You might wonder, watching that, why was the police officer so sure that Falter was being disingenuous? We've been told by multiple people that on that demonstration, Falter was hanging out very close to a pro-Israel counter-protest. Now, if you've been on a pro-Palestine march and seen the pro-Israeli counter-protest, I'm guessing not many of our viewers go on these pro-Israeli counter-protests. They're the kind of sort of demonstration where people are waving Israeli flags, they shout terrorist supporters and Hamas lovers at people who are on the pro-Palestine march, who are protesting against genocide. And if you're on that pro-Palestine march, you're going to see the people waving Israeli flags as somewhat distasteful, right? And that's the point. It's designed precisely to be provocative. Those counter demonstrations are pretty much there to provoke, or to attempt to provoke, the people on the pro-Palestine demos. And provocation is clearly what Falter sought. This is another part of that Sky film.
You're telling me that I cannot walk to the other pavement.
I'm telling you
that I have to be
that I will
escorted by
help
you.
you by escorting you over there. And that way you will be completely safe, just as we promised. So we're keeping our word.
I'm only safe basically if I have a police force. Is that what you're saying?
I think I'm offering it to you, sir. I've already seen you deliberately leave the pavement and walk against this march. You chose to do
I'm
that.
trying to get to the other side of the
your
road. I'm
comment
trying to
about
get to the other side of
is
the road.
disingenuous.
How
You
do
like it or
How do
not?
you want me to get to the other side
I
of the road?
will quite happily walk you over there.
I'm not trying to go
When you get over there.
Gideon Falter has an obvious interest in provoking reactions from pro-Palestine protesters. He's a founder of the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, which appears to many to have been set up largely to smear anti-Zionists as anti-Semites. He's also a board member of the Jewish National Fund, which was set up to help Jews gain control of Arab land in Palestine. And someone who saw straight through the strategy was Ben Jamal from the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. He said this to Sky News.
He suggested he was innocently going for a walk, came across the march and was asked to leave because he was openly Jewish. The reality was he came to the march with an entourage of 4 to 5 people and a film crew, sought to break through the stewards, physically pushes himself past the police in order to walk in front of the march to provoke and to try to stop it. He was trying to provoke a confrontation. That's what happened. People need also to be aware of who Mr. Falter is and the organisation he represents. They're a deeply controversial organisation. They were highly criticised shortly after it was set up by a parliamentary inquiry into anti-Semitism. They were criticised on the basis that they were deliberately conflating anti-Semitism with legitimate criticism of the actions of the Israeli state. They've also been heavily criticised for a stream of Islamophobic comments, including smears against the Mayor of London, and for using anti-Palestinian racist rhetoric. Since the marches have begun, the organisation have tried to stop them. They've even called for the army to be brought onto the streets to stop the marches happening. Now they're using the tactic of coming to the marches, trying to provoke an incident so that they can say there are scenes of disorder and therefore the marches cannot go ahead.
So for his part, Gideon Falter has denied he was part of a counter-protest. He said he didn't come with a video crew, and he's maintained that he simply was taking a walk after attending a synagogue. Now, others have pointed out the demonstration was over 2 kilometres away from the closest synagogue, so it would have had to have been a fairly long walk. Falter on Sky didn't appreciate going head-to-head with Ben Jamal.
The problem with Mr. Falter's presence was not that he is openly Jewish. He's not dealing with the fact that at every single march, there are thousands of Jewish people marching, many of them in an organised...
Not, what rubbish.
They're in an organised bloc, in a Jewish bloc. They are warmly welcomed at every demonstration. Some of them have put out public statements disassociating themselves with what Mr. Falter and his organisation were doing at the last march. So that's...
Let him come back to you on that.
First of all, I don't want to continue having a conversation with Ben Jamal. I'm happy to have an interview with you, but I don't want to carry on.
You did want to come on and talk.
Right. No. I'm not criticising UK.
That you wanted to have the conversation.
I did want to
Final
reply
thought
to
from
what
you
said.
then, Ben Jamal, if I may. Hold on one second.
Now that might strike you as the actions and the attitude of someone whose story is falling apart. Former Chief Superintendent of the Met Police, Del Babu, did not himself agree with Falter's take on the event.
You saw Mr. Falter trying to push police officers out of the way. I mean, that is a common assault. I think you're getting a more accurate picture of what was happening. I think the police dealt with it, tried to be as sensitive as possible. I think the police officer was offering to take Mr. Falter and his group to a place where they could cross more appropriately. Mr. Falter was refusing to move and wanted to cross at that particular place against the march. So I think we're getting a more accurate picture of what's happening. But this is perhaps important for news outlets to ensure that they get an accurate picture. The 13 minutes that the Sky released is very helpful. And I've been asking all weekend since this incident came up, can we see the full footage as opposed to bits that have been edited or placed by Mr. Falter and his supporters?
Now, we are really lucky, actually, that Sky did release that footage, because what happens here, I don't know if Gideon Falter has done it before, but I think we have, people have been aware of this for a while now. We see it in America as well, actually. What you get is you get someone who is very pro-Israel, who goes to a demo, and they can spend hours filming footage of speaking both to police officers and people on the demonstration. And then what they do is they find 10 seconds where it makes a protester or a police person look really bad, right? And as we said, that 10 seconds of that police officer at the start of this segment that we showed you, that was bad, right? He said, you look visibly Jewish, and so therefore you might cause a scene, right? Now, that was a bad thing to say, but if you film enough people for a long enough period of time, you're going to find some of them, one of them saying something wrong over a course of a day, right? And so that's often what happens here. Someone goes and does something that they know is going to be provocative. Now, it's important to say it wasn't provocative because he was openly Jewish. It was provocative because he is openly very pro-Israel, right? That's why it was provocative. That's why the police officer was telling him not to walk through the march in the opposite direction of the marchers, right? Which, so that guy was looking for that. And I think that ex-copper there sort of saying, the media, when they get shown this 10-second clip, they maybe should think about the context, because if it hadn't been for that 13-minute Sky clip, this could still be, the top news story, which is being sort of swallowed uncritically by everyone. So, this could have gone another way. What's interesting, though, in this case, is that Gideon Falter seems to be somewhat isolated even on his side, right? So even the government's own advisor on anti-Semitism has come out and said he doesn't believe Falter was being totally honest.
Mr. Falter would perhaps disagree with you, suggesting that he was there purely to protest. He would argue that he was simply walking in London, and he was stopped from doing so, because he was openly Jewish.
No, let's be quite clear. That is not true. He wasn't just walking in London. It's Shabbat at the time, so the Jewish religious time, and he's been there before at the protests. He's been quite explicit. Before he went on this protest, he'd already called publicly for Sir Mark Rowley to be sacked. There's no ambiguity in what he's doing. But let me show you how he operates. Let me show you this. His organisation has, for the last 6 months, blocked me on from seeing their social media. Now, I'm the independent advisor to government on anti-Semitism. They have other objectives in this. If you're going to block people like myself from seeing your social media, you're not playing it straight.
Now, John Mann is not left-wing by any accounts. Now, I would say that John Mann was someone who likes to smear people who are anti-Israel as being anti-Semitic. So if Gideon Falter is even too extreme for John Mann, right? He was a Labour MP. You might have recognised him. He was the one who was sort of screaming at Ken Livingstone outside the Sky building that you're a Nazi apologist, is what he was screaming at him. He was very, very vocal in the Corbyn years. And even he thinks that Gideon Falter is too extreme to be listened to. Helena, what have you made of this? I suppose, we've shown a lot of mainstream clips there of people sort of outing Gideon Falter for what he is. So people might say, well, it's all the wrong has been righted. But still, I suppose we had a few days in the media of people sort of suggesting, oh my God, these demonstrations are so anti-Semitic that if you merely bump into one, if you stumble upon a demonstration while you're wearing a kippah or any other sort of visible symbol of being Jewish, then you're suddenly going to cause a scene. I mean, how irresponsible was the reporting on this?
That's what I think was so wild to me, is that the original clip, as we showed, as you rightly pointed out beforehand, the sentence is obviously, there is some ambiguity as to what you can take as being the intent of saying that I'm worried about the reaction there would be to you being openly Jewish there. And I'm like, well, that sounds to me like an impugning of the protesters and saying, well, there are anti-Semites over there. Like, if you go there, they might feel like they're provoked because of their innate anti-Semitism. But I think there's some ambiguity there in the statement, regardless of the intent, was clearly wrong. But it just shows you how far these things can go round, not just in the mainstream media, but across social media, and validate everybody's priors without full context, because it's been deliberately cut in a specific context to make a specific point. You talked beforehand in the statements that you made there in the coverage about how there's been plenty of instances of people engaging in anti-Semitism who've been on pro-Palestine protests that have been gone round social media and have been used to be able to tar the entire protest movement as being one of anti-Semitism, when we all know that's not true. Again, what Ben was talking about before with regards to this broad kind of Jewish engagement and the blocks they have on these protests that have been warmly welcomed, which is also true. Just like any large numbers of people, millions of people over the course of the last 6 months marching week after week after week, right? There's bound to be some people there who are genuine anti-Semites, but they are, in isolated instance, cannot be used as a singular brush to tar everybody. But that's, of course, what people who oppose in the pro-Palestine movement want everybody else to think about them, because it's a way of being able to avoid discussion of the real issues that we see every day on our phones as well. What I wanted to mention too is this important bit of context here as well. When there was the discussion between Mr. Falter and the police officer, like the provocation the officer was talking about that we saw in the longer clip and the kind of the longer thing that Sky News released is this idea, well, you went into protest and then you walked against the protest or the march, I guess it is. And if you're not somebody who's been on many marches, like it's worth pointing out that one of the key things about a march is you have to keep moving. You have to keep moving towards the end point to maintain order so that there's along the designated march route. And you can't just stand around and mingle forever apart from at the end point, because that could shut down half much of London forever. And so it's actually against the kind of the rules, I guess, of how we do this march is for anybody to be walking against that current. And so if you're doing that, you're either doing it because you're engaging in something that is against the rules of the march itself, or you're deliberately trying to provoke a reaction from the people who are there. Again, if you just wanted to get to the other side of the road, when the police officer said, well, actually, there's a march going on there, this designated route, I can take you around another way with escort if you want. And then you continually to deliberately say, no, I have to go through this march very specifically, magically with a camera crew, so that suddenly you haven't been able to film that. And with your security there, it doesn't seem to be entirely legitimate to me. And then suddenly he's having a media round. This guy who is already part of multiple organizations, one obviously campaign against anti-Semitism, regardless of the actions of the people who run the campaign, a noble cause which everybody can agree with to stop anti-Semitism, but also one in which, as you mentioned before, is allegedly funding or helping to allow there to be more land grabs of Palestine. Suddenly he has the ability, after this clip goes around, for him to be on doing the media round on Sky, on LBC, on Good Morning Britain, to give only his side of the story, apart from when he's been debating Ben Jamal. And this has allowed him to be able to get much more of visibility for the kind of the side of the narrative that he wants to push, which is, again, I think it is not particularly good form for this all to have happened before we'd all seen the real context.
We've said, in one way, the relief here is that many in the media seem to have woken up to what was really going on here. However, the bad news, despite the full footage of Falter's confrontation with the police having been released, politicians are still pretending they haven't really seen it, right? Instead, they're making political capital out of what appears to have been a deliberate provocation. Can you imagine? This was Prime Minister Rishi Sunak.
I share the shock and the anger that many are feeling when they saw the clips over the weekend. And, what I would say about Mark Rowley and the police, they do have a difficult job. Of course, I appreciate that. But what happened was clearly wrong. And it's right that they've apologised for that. And yes, I do have confidence in him, but that's on the basis that he works to rebuild the confidence and trust of not just the Jewish community, but the wider public, particularly people in London, but more broadly. And you regain that trust and that confidence by making it clear that the police are not tolerating behaviour that we would all collectively deem unacceptable when we see it, because it undermines our values.
They weren't tolerating behaviour that we would see as, I think, unacceptable, which is turning up to a protest deliberately to try and provoke a reaction, right? You get this from both sides. So what the police always do, if you have a far-right demonstration and then left-wing anti-racist protesters, the police's main job is always to keep them apart because they don't want to see, fights in the streets, public disorder. And I think that's a kind of policing that does actually have quite widespread consent. I think people think, we want people to be able to get their voices heard, but we don't want, just people fighting in the street. We don't want chaos. We don't want disorder. So please keep them apart. And that's often, really their big job on some of those days is just to keep people apart. And so the police were, in this case, doing their job quite well. Now, we should be clear, he phrased it badly, right? The sentence he said was wrong, but the intention was actually quite noble, and he carried it out, apart from that one sentence, quite well. So the idea that, they need to regain trust because of this incident seems to me a little bit misguided, other than that, they need to be careful with the language they use. Labour's Shadow Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson appeared on Sky News. She said this.
Should Sir Mark Rowley resign?
I don't think that's the answer. I think what we've seen in terms of that video that you've been showing and what took place subsequently was evidently completely unacceptable. I think the Met now have a job of work to do to make sure that they rebuild trust with the Jewish community. I understand they're meeting with community leaders today to do precisely that. The police have got a difficult job, and policing protest isn't easy, and there will be occasions where things go wrong. But I think it's completely unacceptable if Jewish people feel unsafe on our streets, and there can be no place for anti-Semitism on any kind of march or on our streets or within our society. But the Met do have a responsibility to balance that, to make sure that people have the right to protest, but ensuring that it doesn't cross a line.
Blah, 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 blah. That's classic, Labour politician. I'm going to spend a minute saying absolutely nothing. So I'm sorry we wasted 45 seconds of your time by showing you that, to be honest, but there we are. One politician who was a bit more forthright, at least she said something, even if it was completely bizarre and wrong, was Home Secretary Suella Braverman. She's very expert at this, saying bold things which are wrong. Over the weekend, she called for Met Commissioner Mark Rowley to resign. And on Radio 4's Today programme, she was asked to justify that call.
The incident involving a man being called openly Jewish by a Metropolitan Police officer. You've called for the Metropolitan Police chief to go. Can I ask, have you seen the whole video involving Gideon Falter?
I've seen clips of the video as have been published, but this is more about what's happened over the last 6 months.
The whole video has been published by Sky News. There's 13 minutes of it. And in the footage, Gideon Falter insists that he's only trying to cross the road down which the demonstration is passing, but that's disputed by an officer who has a lengthy exchange with him, including offering to lead him out in a different direction, and essentially accuses him of being disingenuous and seeking to antagonize the marchers. I wonder if that changes your position at all, because police officers do have a duty, don't they, to keep the peace, which is the conclusion that many come to after watching the footage.
Well, my complaint is not against the individual police officers. They are all working really hard in really difficult circumstances. My complaint is the wholesale failure to combat anti-Semitism and to maintain the peace on the streets of London over the last 6 months. There's been a failure.
It was this incident, wasn't it, that sparked your call for the Metropolitan Police chief to resign or be sacked?
This incident shines a light on what has been happening.
But you haven't seen the video of the whole incident.
What the video shows and what the incident demonstrates is that the police have failed to strike the right balance of competing rights. Now, I support the right to peaceful protest, but if the police themselves, and this is what the video shows, consider that there is a risk of anti-Semitic attacks on a Jewish person, if they consider that threat to exist, what they've chosen to do, and this is where I believe they've gone wrong in the strategy and the leadership, they've chosen to say to the innocent Jewish person that that person must give up their rights and they'll be arrested if they don't.
We've all seen the clip, Suella. It had been out for 24 hours. She's called for the Met Commissioner to resign. That's not a small ask, right? It's not like me tweeting, oh, this clip's troubling. She's the former Home Secretary. She said, I don't know much about Mark Rowley, but presumably he's worked his whole life to get that job, got the job. And she said, I've watched a 7-second clip and he should resign. And then she's asked, well, there is a 13-minute clip where you can see the content. No, I haven't watched it, but I'm talking about actually a broader issue, which is that if they think you're not safe because you're Jewish and so you can't walk down, well, the bigger video shows that that's not what they think. Clearly, the longer video shows the reason the police officer thinks that man would not be safe walking through the demonstration is because he is trying to provoke people and he is standing close to a pro-Israel demonstration. The reason he might not be safe is not because he's Jewish. The police officer will know very well that there are lots of Jewish people on that march, right? The reason he's going to be unsafe is because he's a pro-Israel activist. Now, as we keep saying, he used a wrong sentence, but the idea that a police officer using a wrong sentence while doing, I think, what is on the whole an honourable job in this situation, the reason that a Met Commissioner should resign for that seems a little bit disproportionate to me. And that interview went on.
I suggest that perhaps you should watch. I suggest that you should perhaps watch the whole video before deciding exactly what you think the risks were.
This is really important that I have a chance to say this because this is a really important issue. That cannot be the right approach to handling this problem. The right approach if the police consider there to be an anti-Semitic threat, which is clear from the video and clear from all of these marches, is that the police must confront that threat directly head on. And the police must be going to those people who they believe may be threatening to attack this person for being Jewish, anti-Semitically. They must direct their concerns at those people and say, if you attack this Jewish person,
I think
you'll be arrested.
I think
the video clearly does not show that.
You haven't seen the whole video.
I have seen enough of the video.
You know,
I have seen enough of the video to know that the protesters were threatening to attack the Jewish man anti-Semitically, which is a construction I haven't heard before. That was an ex-Home Secretary, very much out of her depth. I have to say credit to Michelle Hussein, I think, who conducted that interview very impressively, because to go on the radio and say, I have seen enough of the video, he should resign. And then you're being asked, well, have you seen the actual context for what happened? No, but he should resign. I mean, that would be a resigning offence if she was still Home Secretary. She is ex-Home Secretary. She might be the leader of the opposition one day. Let's have our fingers crossed that we won't be subjected to that. Let's wrap up there. Helena, it's been a slightly longer than usual show, but it's been a pleasure having you on this evening.
The feeling is always incredibly mutual, Michael. Thank you again, and always looking forward to next time.
And thank you all for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.